Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to really challenge how you probably think about the future. It's almost automatic, isn't it? Like when we picture what's coming, our minds just start adding things, more gadgets, shiny new innovations, maybe flying cars, uh, pills for meals, holographic stuff, always piling on the new. But what if I told you that this way of imagining the future, this additive instinct, is often completely backward? What if the real secret, the key to understanding what's actually coming, what will last, and maybe more importantly, what will inevitably break, is really a game of, well, subtraction? It kind of flies in the face of everything we're told, right? Always chasing the next big thing. But maybe, just maybe, the deepest insights aren't in the new, but in what's incredibly enduringly old.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here is how Nassim Nicholas Taleb, through his whole concept of anti-fragility, just completely flips our usual thinking
Yeah.
about innovation, about longevity, even about what progress really means. He just turns it on its head. So this deep dive, it's all about digging into that subtle but really powerful idea of time itself acting like this relentless filter. A filter that carefully separates the stuff that's just fleeting, the fragile things, from what's truly enduring, the anti-fragile. We're so conditioned to look for novelty, for what just popped up. But Taleb's suggesting, no, look deeper. The real wisdom, the most reliable way to see ahead is in recognizing what's already managed to survive.
Absolutely. It's a total paradigm shift. So our mission today really is to explore why, often feels really counterintuitive, why the old so often wins out over the new. We'll dive into how you might predict things not by adding, but by subtracting, figuring out what won't make it. And we'll try to uncover some of those hidden mental biases, the things that kind of blind us to how time really works as magic, or maybe it's destruction, on technology, on ideas, even on how we see ourselves. We're going to be leaning heavily on the discussions around Taleb's big work, Anti-Fragile, especially those bits about time and fragility. Hopefully give you a kind of shortcut to seeing the world and definitely the future in a really different, maybe more robust way. It's going to be, I think, quite an illuminating, maybe even slightly unsettling journey into the surprising power of things just sticking around. Okay, let's start by just quickly revisiting that core idea. Anti-fragility, we've talked about it before. It's not just being tough or resilient. It's about actually benefiting from shocks, from volatility, disorder, stress, getting stronger when things get chaotic.
And the opposite, fragile, well, that gets harmed, maybe even destroyed by that same chaos. It's this basic asymmetry, right? But how does that idea, which sounds kind of physical, connect to something like, well, time, which seems so abstract? How does time act like a stressor?
Yeah, that's the crucial link. In Taleb's framework, time functions exactly like disorder. It's this relentless, constant stressor. Don't think of time as just the smooth line ticking forward. Think of it as a continuous arrival of new stuff, new variables, unexpected challenges, unforeseen events. It is volatility spread out. Every single moment, every day, every year, it introduces these tiny shifts, sometimes imperceptible, and then occasionally, bam, a huge, unpredictable shock. So just like that fragile glass vase shatters if you drop it, a fragile idea or a fragile company or a fragile technology, it eventually just breaks under the steady, unavoidable pressure of time passing. The longer something has been around, the more of these stresses, big and small, it must have survived. And that survival itself becomes this powerful proof of its inherent robustness, or maybe even its anti-fragility. Time is always applying pressure, slowly, patiently uncovering weaknesses. Only the truly resilient things actually stick around. It's like this ultimate long-term stress test. And time finds the cracks eventually. It proves, as Taleb says, that time knows more about its fragility than we do.
That makes a ton of sense. It paints a really vivid picture. It reminds me of that quote Taleb uses from the ancient Greek poet Simonides of Ceos, 6th century BC. He said, time has sharp teeth that destroy everything, which sounds kind of poetic, maybe a bit grim. But if you look at it through this anti-fragility lens, it suddenly sounds less like poetry and more like a scientific observation almost.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Simonides' image, which you see echoed all through literature, from Ovid right up to modern writers, it highlights time's destructive side. And this is the crucial point, it doesn't destroy just anything. It specifically, almost surgically, destroys the fragile. It's a very selective process. What survives those sharp teeth? It's the stuff that's proven its resilience, its ability to withstand shocks, or maybe even its capacity to somehow gain from the chaos, to adapt and get stronger. So that raises a really interesting question for us, and for you listening too. What does it really mean to survive here? It's not just physical endurance. It implies this sort of inherent fitness, right? A deep robustness and adaptability that lets something stand up to the sheer unpredictability of existence. The older something non-perishable is, the more likely it is to have this quality, because if it were fragile, time would have already chewed it up and spat it out, maybe through 1,000 tiny cuts or one big black swan event.
Right. And that leads directly to this really powerful, maybe even paradoxical predictive tool. Fragile things will eventually break. And surprisingly, Taleb argues, we can often tell what's fragile. This is a key difference he makes. We spend so much energy trying to predict the good stuff, the positive black swans, the next internet, the miracle cure, which he says is basically impossible to predict reliably. But the negative black swans, the sudden collapses, the unforeseen disasters, those, he argues, are often much easier to spot because they grow out of fragility that's already there, that we can often identify.
Yeah, this totally changes how you'd approach forecasting, doesn't it? Instead of trying to guess what new thing is going to pop up, the next killer app, the next dominant company, we can actually get pretty good at predicting what won't last. Think about highly leveraged financial firms. Their whole structure makes them super fragile if the market takes a sudden hit. Or, think about really rigid, top-down planned economies. Their lack of flexibility, their inability to adapt quickly makes them vulnerable to unexpected shocks. The more something depends on the future being perfectly predictable, the more rigid it has to be and the more brittle it becomes. That makes it incredibly fragile to those unpredictable negative events, the black swans. And those people or systems or ideas that consistently underestimate black swans, that build fragile things, well, eventually they just kind of exit the picture. It's very Darwinian, applied to ideas and tech. Time is the selector. As time goes on, the chance of a black swan hitting something fragile just keeps going up. So while guessing the next big positive thing is like finding a needle in a haystack, you can be pretty confident that things prone to black swans will, eventually, get wiped out by history. Which means, kind of weirdly, that long-term predictions can actually be more reliable if you frame them negatively, if you predict what won't be around rather than guessing what will.
Okay, now this is where things get really interesting, and honestly, pretty counterintuitive for most of us. Taleb brings in this idea that he calls the Lindy effect. It's like a rule of thumb for how long certain things last. And here's the wild part. For these specific kinds of things, the longer something has already been around, the longer you can expect it to keep being around. That just feels wrong somehow based on our everyday experience, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a total departure from how we normally think about age. For perishable things, living stuff like us, animals, even like a banana, every extra day you live actually means you have a shorter expected time left, on average. A 40-year-old generally has fewer years left than a 10-year-old. There's kind of a built-in expiry date, a natural lifespan, and the closer you get, the less time is likely remaining. It follows more of a bell curve, But for non-perishable things, stuff that's more informational, or things that don't decay biologically, the exact opposite holds true. Their very survival becomes this powerful signal of likely future survival. We're talking ideas, technologies, books, maybe institutions, even jokes, maybe enduring designs for physical objects.
Okay, let's pause there because that distinction, perishable versus non-perishable, seems absolutely critical to getting Lindy right. Can you give us a few more clear examples just to nail that down?
Definitely. Think about it like this. Your specific car, the one sitting in your garage, that's perishable. It's going to rust, parts will wear out, eventually it's scrap metal. But the idea of the automobile, the basic technology concept of a self-propelled vehicle, that's non-perishable. It's been around over a century, constantly changing, adapting, but the core concept persists. Or take a book, a physical copy of, say, Homer's Odyssey, perishable. It can get burned, torn, moldy, but the story itself, the epic poem, that's non-perishable. It gets copied, translated, put online, told orally.
Yeah.
It just keeps going for millennia. Same with like an old Greek temple building, perishable. But the architectural principles, non-perishable. A specific performance of a song, perishable. The melody and lyrics, non-perishable.
Got it. Okay. So applying Lindy then.
Yeah.
If a book has been in print for, say, 40 years continuously.
Exactly. According to the Lindy effect, your best guess for its future time in print is another 40 years. But here's the really mind-bending twist. If it survives another 10 years, so it's now been in print for 50 years, its expected future life actually increases to another 50 years. So basically, every year it survives without dying off, it effectively doubles its additional life expectancy from that point forward. This isn't just some statistical quirk, it's a strong indicator of robustness. It's like the item's robustness is proportional to how long it's already lived. This applies to anything that doesn't age in that biological wear and tear sense that humans do. Its continued existence is proof it passed the time test, filtering out the fragile versions and showing it's fit to keep going.
That example of Richard Gott in the Broadway shows is amazing. It makes it so concrete. He looked at shows running in 93, used a similar logic to predict the longest-running ones would keep running the longest and the short ones would disappear fastest. And he was like, 95% right? That's incredible. And even more intuitively, him as a kid visiting the pyramids and the Berlin Wall and just having that gut feeling the ancient structure would outlast the modern wall. Powerful stuff.
Yeah, they're not just cute stories. They really show this powerful winner-take-all dynamic and longevity. Surviving the initial test of time give you this compounding advantage. Think about really simple everyday things, like a spoon. You find spoons in ancient Roman ruins, Pompeii for instance, and the basic design. It's hardly changed from what's in your kitchen drawer today. Kitchen utensils generally are super anti-fragile. The core designs last for ages, unlike those trendy single-purpose kitchen gadgets that are hot for 6 months and then vanish. Or think about what we call classical style. It could be a haircut, a suit, architecture, even classical music or notions of beauty. We're drawn to them not because their fashionable fashion is, by definition, fleeting, but because they feel timeless or ethereal. That's just another way of saying they're anti-fragile and non-perishable. They resonate across centuries because they've already outlived countless fads and changing tastes. They don't follow trends. They are the enduring benchmark. Same goes for things like, basic mathematical principles from Euclid or philosophical ideas from Plato. Still fundamental, unlike maybe scientific theories from just a few hundred years ago.
Right. But despite how powerful it sounds, it seems like people often get the Lindy effect wrong, don't they? It's not saying every single old thing lasts forever, or that your specific, maybe kind of fragile old landline phone is guaranteed to outlive the entire internet concept, right? That seems like a misapplication.
Oh, absolutely. You're hitting on a really common mistake people make with probability and statistics. It's easy to misapply these ideas. The core principle is the technologies or ideas that were prone to aging, the ones that had hidden fragilities, they're already gone, dead and buried. We're only observing the survivors. So the mistake is thinking that just because something offers an obvious benefit now, it's guaranteed to survive. We confuse a necessary condition for survival, being robust, with a sufficient one, just being beneficial. It's like trying to apply average life expectancy figures to a specific person you know has a terminal illness. You wouldn't take the general actuarial tables for a healthy 40-year-old and say, oh, this person with stage 4 cancer definitely has another 44 years. That's absurd, right? The table applies to the average healthy person, not this specific fragile case. Similarly, saying the internet, just because it's maybe 20 or 30 years old now, only has another 20 or 30 years left, that's misapplying Lindy. It's a probabilistic average for robust, non-perishable items, not some deterministic forecast for every single thing, ignoring its specific strengths or weaknesses. The older a robust technology or idea is, the more confidence we can have in its continued existence as a concept or design. We don't think of the wheel as old like it's decaying. It's old because it has survived and proven its anti-fragile utility over millennia. The longer it lasts, the more proof we have of its resistance to time's sharp teeth, and the stronger our expectation that it will keep persisting.
Okay, this really leads us to a fundamental problem with how we usually picture the future. Like we said at the start, when you ask someone, what's the future look like? In key, their brain almost inevitably starts adding things. This cascade of innovations, new tech, improvements, we take today as the starting point and just pile on new products, new features, super complex systems. Flying cars, food pills, holodecks, colonies on Mars. It's always more and always newer. And this seems to lead to predictions that are just wildly off base, historically speaking.
Exactly. Taleb argues this whole approach is completely backward, profoundly flawed. He points out that our actual world right now looks way, way more like the past than futurists from, say, the 50s or 60s ever imagined it would, or maybe even wanted it to. And the issue isn't just that they missed a few specific things like, oops, forgot the internet, or, hey, nobody predicted wheels on suitcases, which is kind of funny. That simple, incredibly useful innovation. The much bigger mistake, he says, is that almost everything they predicted didn't happen, apart from maybe a few things they got lucky on. This really highlights this deep, almost unconscious bias we have towards an additive future, probably driven by, wishful thinking, utopian dreams, or just a fascination with novelty. We tend to over-engineer the future in our minds, filling it with high-tech fixes for problems that might not even exist, while totally ignoring the simple, enduring solutions already staring us in the face.
And this constant urge to over-technologize the future, this almost unthinking embrace of newness just because it's new. Taleb has a name for that, right? He calls it neomania. And the irony is, this love of the new often brings fragility, not the robustness we might expect.
Yeah, neomania. It's this uncritical, almost childlike fascination with the new, driven more by a desire for novelty itself than by any real assessment of utility or resilience or even, frankly, aesthetics. He uses the analogies like assuming someone wearing a tie must be an empty suit, but then thinking that not wearing a tie automatically guarantees substance. It's flawed logic. These techno-thinkers, as he sometimes calls them, or technological intellectuals, they often have what he describes as an engineering mind, which isn't necessarily a compliment in his view. It means a love for precision and complexity, sometimes even when it's not useful, a tendency to dismiss history and all the wisdom baked into it, and often a kind of lack of grounding in literature or philosophy. And Taleb argues this is actually a huge blind spot for seeing the future clearly, because it completely ignores the lessons from what's already survived, what's passed the brutal test of time. They get fixated on the shiny object itself, the tech, rather than the human need it's supposed to meet or the system it fits into. And that disconnect leads to massively misjudging what will actually stick around. It's like prioritizing novelty over effectiveness.
Okay, so if adding stuff doesn't work, if trying to predict the next big thing is mostly futile, Taleb insists the only valid way to think about the future, the only reliable method of prophecy, is what he calls via negativa, by way of negation. It's about taking away, subtracting, figuring out what won't be there. That feels like a really radical shift from how most people, especially in tech or business, operate.
It totally flips the script on prediction. The idea is whatever's fragile now, it's going to get replaced eventually. But the specific thing that replaces it, that's fundamentally unpredictable. All those specific gadgets and systems we imagine will be the future, probably not them, not the ones we're currently hyping. Anyway. So this via negativa method, it's about looking at the present and identifying what doesn't belong in the future because it's inherently weak, what's fragile. Fragile things will break, and luckily we can often spot fragility. Look for things that depend on perfect prediction. Look for complex systems where one failure cascades. Look for things that rely on a single non-diverse input. Look for financial instruments nobody really understands. Look for social trends tied only to one fleeting demographic moment. These things are fragile, and here's the paradox again. This means longer-term predictions, if you frame them using via negativa, can actually be more reliable than short-term ones. Why? Because you can be almost certain that anything prone to black swans will, given enough time, eventually get hit and disappear. Time increases the odds. Whereas typical predictions, especially about new things, their accuracy just tanks over time, especially when things aren't linear. The further out you look, the fuzzier the additive picture gets. But the subtractive picture, that gets clearer. You know the fragile stuff is doomed.
Taleb has this brilliant thought experiment he uses to really ground this. It makes it much less abstract. He says, imagine you're going out to dinner tonight, maybe meeting friends. Then he points out, okay, he might be wearing shoes whose basic design isn't that different from Ötzi the Iceman's, found frozen from 5,300 years ago. He'd use silverware that's Mesopotamian tech, drink wine, a tradition going back maybe 6,000 years, sip it from a glass Phoenician, maybe 2,900 years old. He'd eat, say, artisanal cheese, made pretty much the same way for centuries, and sit on a chair design that's been around at least 3,000 years. And how did he get there? He walked, or maybe took a cab, a technology basically a century old, often driven by immigrants, just like it was in Paris or New York 100 years ago.
Right. Now contrast that reality with how someone in, say, 1950 would have predicted that same dinner happening in the year 2000 or 2020. They'd probably imagine everyone in shiny, maybe slightly uncomfortable synthetic spacesuits, eating nutrient paste or pills, communicating via screens, maybe even across galaxies from remote colonies. The actual reality is just so much less futuristic in its core components than generations of futurists dreamed up. Most of what really lasts, what forms the bedrock of our lives, isn't the flashy new stuff, it's the refined old stuff. David Egerton made that great point in the early 2000s. The world was making 2.5 times more bicycles than cars. And most of our tech effort goes into just maintaining existing stuff or making small improvements to old technologies. We massively underestimate the power of what Taleb calls the equivalence of those little wheels on suitcases, the simple, robust, enduring innovations that will probably still be with us 1,000 years from now. They're the things quietly shaping our lives because they aren't revolutionary. They're just deeply useful and anti-fragile.
Okay, so if that's the case, what does this all mean for how we should think about technology itself, its purpose, its value? It sounds like you're saying that technology, when it's really working well, when it's at its best, isn't about adding layers of complexity or showing off how new it is or constantly demanding our attention. Instead, maybe its greatest value, its real elegance, comes when it becomes invisible. When it does its job by removing something bad, something unnatural, maybe alienating, or just inherently fragile from our lives. It's not about the addition, but the subtraction of a negative.
That's a really profound way to look at it, yeah. A major shift. Think about many of the modern tools or applications that have genuinely stuck around and become part of the fabric of our lives. Often, they didn't just add a new capability, they removed something negative, something that was often a byproduct of an earlier, maybe clumsier version of modernity, like the internet. Okay, it has its own unnatural aspects for sure, but think about what it removed. Piles of paperwork waiting endlessly on hold or in physical lines for some indifferent bureaucrat, navigating those infuriating automated phone menus, press 1-4. Ooh. It helped break down some of that opaque pseudo-rigor and centralized control of big, slow corporations and traditional media gatekeepers. Or think about how reliable digital payments remove the risk and hassle of carrying lots of cash, or how instant messaging removes the anxiety of waiting days for a letter to arrive. It's technology acting as a form of via negativa itself, pruning away the inefficiencies, the frustrations, the fragilities that built up over time.
That's a really cool way to frame it, technology as elegant subtraction. And you actually see this trend happening now, this sort of reverse technology idea. Look at the shoe industry, for instance. For decades, it was all about engineering ever more complex, running shoes, more cushioning, more support, special arches, fancy materials. And now, a huge trend is towards shoes that try to replicate being barefoot. These minimalist designs, thin soles. They protect your foot, sure, but they don't dictate how you move. It's like they're selling us back the calloused feet of a hunter-gatherer, letting us reconnect with how we're naturally meant to walk.
Exactly. That's a perfect example. It's technology being used deliberately to undo the potential negative side effects of previous technologies, to bring us back to something more natural, maybe less fragile in the long run for our bodies. Similarly, think about tablets. Yeah, they have amazing processing power, but one of their great uses, Taleb points out, is letting us write by hand again, directly on the screen, like going back to our Babylonian and Phoenician roots of writing. It feels different, maybe more intuitive, more soothing for some tasks than constantly mediating through a keyboard. And there's growing evidence it helps with learning and memory, too, engaging the brain differently. Conversely, think about why some other highly touted new technologies, maybe some early smartwatches or those big VR headsets, haven't quite become ubiquitous yet, despite huge hype and investment. Often, Taleb suggests, it's because they just look or feel unnatural. They kind of alienate the user from their social surroundings. They disrupt normal interaction instead of enhancing it smoothly. The tech that succeeds most profoundly often blends in, like those tiny wireless earbuds. They're almost invisible. They enhance your experience without shouting, "Look at my tech." They don't alienate you nearly as much.
Yeah, Taleb mentions the qualm. He uses it as a placeholder for some incredibly important technology that nobody ever talks about, precisely because it works so well and is so unobtrusive. It's designed to be less and less noticeable, constantly improved to become more invisible, more seamless, like indoor plumbing or reliable electricity.
Right. And that raises this really important question for all of us, for you listening. Are we, maybe, without always realizing it, moving towards a future where the best, most advanced, most successful technology is the stuff we don't even perceive as technology anymore? Where the ultimate goal isn't more features, but seamless integration. So it just becomes part of our environment, like a well-designed chair or those ancient spoon designs still working perfectly today. It really shifts the focus, doesn't it? Away from the flashy, noisy new thing towards the quiet, enduringly useful, unobtrusive solution. The real elegance, maybe, is in technology that just gets out of the way and lets us live more naturally, without the friction and artificiality that so many fragile, unproven new things tend to introduce.
Okay, it all makes a certain kind of logical sense when you lay it out like this, but it still feels, well, it pushes against how we're trained to think, doesn't it? And a big part of why we keep overhyping the new and underestimating the sheer power and resilience of the old seems to come down to some basic mental biases we all share. The first one you mentioned is a kind of survivorship bias, right? The fact that information itself naturally hides failures. We hear all the time about the big successes, the overnight stock market millionaire, the blockbuster novel, but the massive pile of failures. They just disappear. They're silent, buried.
Exactly. This bias is huge. It makes us systematically overestimate our chances of success in almost anything. Finance, art, starting a business, you name it. We see that all the technologies or ideas or companies that survived seem to have obvious benefits. And then we make this logical leap. We mistakenly assume that any new thing offering obvious benefits will survive. We confuse something that might be necessary for survival, like being useful, with something that's sufficient, guaranteed success. And this completely blinds us to that enormous graveyard of failed innovations. Think of all the brilliant ideas, the promising startups, the books that seemed great but just didn't make it. They also had obvious benefits, but they were fragile in some way, time exposed. We don't see the millions of manuscripts that never got published or the thousands of restaurants that closed after a year. We only see the survivors on the shelves or still open for business. It gives us this totally warped view of the odds and makes us miss the crucial role fragility plays in deciding what lasts and what vanishes.
That makes total sense. And the second big bias you talked about is how our brains are basically wired for efficiency. They prefer minimal effort. So we tend to notice things that change, things that vary much more easily than things that are constant, even if those constant things are way more important overall. We notice the flickering screen more than the stable foundation it rests on.
Yeah, this heuristic, this mental shortcut in noticing variation, instead of the total picture, it's incredibly common. Kahneman and Tversky did loads of work on this, like the example of wealth perception. Tell someone they lost $10,000, and they'll be way more upset than if you tell them their total portfolio dropped from $785,000 to $775,000. Same amount, totally different emotional reaction because we focus on the change, the loss, not the total context. Our brains just latch onto variation because it's easier, requires less processing, less memory. And in a broader sense, think about it. We depend infinitely more on, say, clean running water or a stable power grid than on the very latest iPhone model. But because the water just keeps flowing usually and the electricity stays on mostly, while our phones are constantly being updated, advertised, buzzed about as new and improved, we end up thinking the phones play a much bigger, more critical role than they actually do compared to that fundamental, unchanging infrastructure. This bias just makes us constantly overvalue the shiny new thing and underestimate the quiet, enduring, often invisible foundations of our lives.
And there's a third mistake, which feels kind of insidious, that feeds into this whole thing. This idea that you act young or you're cool or you're with the times only if you adopt every single new piece of technology that comes along. It creates this weird pressure. And you even hear these futurist consultants accusing people to don't jump on every bandwagon of thinking old.
Right, and this leads to this really weird inversion of how we think about generational contributions. It creates this illusion that younger generations contribute more simply because they adopt newer stuff faster. Now, don't get me wrong, Taleb definitely values the young for their energy, their freedom from being totally locked into the system, their courage to try new things, which older people often lose as they get, mortgages and responsibilities trapped in life, as he puts it. But the ideas the young often propose tend to be fragile, not because they're young, but simply because most untested, unseasoned ideas are fragile no matter who proposes them. It takes time to weed out the fragility. And of course, if your job is selling the future or the next big thing, you're not going to make money telling people about the enduring value of stuff that's already been around for centuries. It's way more profitable to hype the new, regardless of whether it will actually last. It's like that flawed logic, again, thinking you'll turn into a cow if you eat beef. It confuses the age of the information or technology with biological aging. Information doesn't decay like a person does. The wheel isn't old and decrepit. It's old because it has survived, proving its incredible robustness.
Okay, so if chasing the newest trend is often a trap, and our own brains are kind of working against us here, how do we prepare ourselves? Or maybe more practically, how should we think about educating kids for a future, say the 21st century and beyond, when we honestly have no idea what specific skills will be most valuable in 20, 50, even 100 years? Taleb apparently got asked this directly, and his answer is just beautifully simple and profound. Make them read the classics.
It's such a great answer, isn't it? It's like taking Karl Popper's critique of historicism, the flawed idea you can predict the future from past patterns, and flipping it around. The future, Taleb suggests, isn't primarily about anticipating what new things are coming. It's about understanding what will remain. There's that old Arab proverb, "He who does not have a past has no future." Think about it. We don't go back to medieval textbooks to learn cutting-edge physics or genetics, right? Because science progresses, builds, discards old theories. It's inherently dynamic and, in a way, perishable at the detailed level. But we do still read Homer. We read Plato. We read the Stoics. We read Shakespeare, who feels incredibly modern sometimes. Why? Because great literature, classical philosophy, they aren't about forecasting the future. They're about understanding the past in the deepest sense, understanding enduring human nature, timeless dilemmas, fundamental truths about life, power, love, loss, stuff that just resonates across thousands of years. These works are the anti-fragile ones. They're classics precisely because they've survived the ultimate filter time itself, proving their profound relevance again and again across different cultures, different eras. So understanding what's anti-fragile within us as humans, what has never really been lost, what endures in our nature and wisdom and fundamental principles, that, Taleb argues, is the only truly reliable tool we have for navigating an inherently unpredictable future. It's about shifting from looking for novelty out there to recognizing and cultivating permanence in here. Hashtag tag tag outro.
Wow. Okay, so what's the big takeaway here for you, our listener? Our deep dive today is really, I think, unpacked this incredibly counterintuitive power of time and the surprising, often hidden resilience of things that are old. It really boils down to recognizing that genuine innovation, lasting progress, might not always be about creating something radically new, something flashy or complex. Maybe it's more often about refining what we already have, about simplifying, about subtracting the stuff that doesn't work or causes harm, and just allowing the truly robust, the anti-fragile things to endure and quietly make our lives better over the long haul.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this whole framework really pushes for a fundamental shift in how we see the world. Instead of automatically chasing every shiny new gadget, every fleeting trend, every hyped up next big thing, it encourages us to look deeper, look for the underlying principles that last, look for the enduring designs, look for those invisible technologies that are powerful because they remove friction, or artificiality because they let us connect with something more fundamental. It's a potent reminder that real wisdom often comes not from predicting the new, but from carefully observing what has managed to last. It's about developing an eye for permanence in a world obsessed with novelty.
So here's a little mental exercise for you to try next time you find yourself thinking about the future, maybe planning ahead, wondering what's coming. Instead of instinctively asking, what new thing will I add to my life? What new gadget or skill or trend should I jump on? Just pause and ask yourself instead, what will not change in the next 20 years? What around me or inside me is so inherently anti-fragile that it will almost certainly still be here, maybe just refined, maybe more invisible, more integrated. You might actually be surprised by what comes to mind, by how much enduring value is already present, working quietly, effectively, often completely unnoticed.
Yeah, and building right on that, maybe the deeper question for you, the listener, is this. What in your own life think about your habits, your core knowledge, maybe your key relationships, your fundamental values? What parts of you are truly anti-fragile? What has already stood the test of time in your experience? What's proven resilient and maybe even gotten stronger when things got tough? And how might leaning into those enduring elements, really understanding their timeless value, actually prepare you better for whatever the unpredictable future throws your way, much more effectively than just constantly chasing the latest, probably quite fragile trend?